Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. The Sudan for most people is just a name in the news. This magnificent book corrects that. Its wise and well-informed text and lavish pictures give the country a face, irresistible, photogenic, bewitching, and profoundly human in all its fabulous Sudanese variety. So Paul Thoreau wrote of Sudan, the land and its people. We're fortunate today to have with us as our guests the co-authors of this book, Timothy Carney, former United States Ambassador to the Sudan, and his wife Victoria Butler. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, it may surprise you to know that I don't often get United States ambassadors and well-known freelance journalists on my program, so tell us, how did you all get to Paducah?
Vicki, please.
I am very fortunate in that my brother, Jack Butler, lives in Paducah, and his wife, Dr. Sharon Butler, and my nephew and my niece. So it's always a pleasure to come to Paducah for us.
Well, we're glad to have you. Tell us about the book. How did it come to pass? And the photography, by the way, wonderful. Michael Freeman, a well-known photographer for the Smithsonian, and just terrific stuff. We'll be showing the book in a moment. How did this book come to pass?
It came to pass largely due to Vicki's endeavors. We looked at Sudan, and we'd been dismayed since we left Sudan in 1997 at the simplistic, sometimes even mindless views that we would see or read or hear about the country. And I wanted to complicate people's minds about the place, and Vicki had not only the great idea, but the best way to do that, Vicki.
Let me, I have a copy of the book, beautiful book, the cover. And that is a whirling dervish, an expression we've all heard. How did that picture come to pass? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this picture was taken at one of the most important mosques in the town of Omdurman, which is right across the river from Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan. And it's a member of the Qadriya sect of the Sufis, who are a subset of the Sunnis. And Sudanese, the majority of the Muslim population in Sudan are in fact Sufis. And the majority, the largest number of Sufis are in fact Qadriya. And so every Friday at this particular mosque, Hamad el Nil in Omdurman, you will find people conducting what is called a zikr. And a zikr usually happens after Friday prayers, and people begin to chant the 99 names of Allah, and they work themselves into an ecstatic fervor, I guess, which they think helps bring them closer to God. Is that a...
That's absolutely on track.
Let's, if you bear with me, I've been really enjoying looking through this. Let's look at, this is a magnificent picture here, just terrific.
This photograph is taken in Darfur. It's the state of North Darfur. It's right on the edge of the town of Tawila. And these young women are internally displaced by the fighting between the Janjaweed and their ethnic group. I believe these are Zagawa, the ethnic group Zagawa. And they have gathered at this edge of town looking for help, hoping to find their way into a displaced persons camp. And as you can see by the great concern on the face of the young woman there on your right, there's just a lot of anxiety over their situation.
Explain to our viewers the situation in the Sudan. It's in the news, obviously, but just give us a capsule description of what's going on in Sudan today.
There are three things going on in Sudan today. One is that a 50-year civil war came to an end in January of last year. That was a civil war between the northerners, who are heavily Muslim and who believe themselves to be basically Arab. In fact, of course, they're Afro-Arabs, as the photos in this book make abundantly clear. And the war was with the Southerners, who are of traditional religion or Christian, and they were fighting mainly over power, over the northern desire to dominate and control the entirety of Sudan. It's a war that started in 1955, had a brief hiatus, and then resumed only to end last year.
Did this war have Cold War overtones? Did the United States back one side and the Soviets the other?
There were no significant Cold War overtones to the best of my recollection. There was a lot of unhappiness from Black Africa, from Kenya, from Uganda, that Africans, which is what these Southerners very clearly are, were being put down in an effort made to crush their political ambitions, failure to satisfy their grievances on the part of these people who declared themselves to be Arabs in the north. So there was a lot of support for the insurgency that started, for the civil war that was fought between the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and the government of Sudan itself. The U.S. had a big role in catalyzing the successful mediation and negotiations by Kenya that brought about peace in January of last year, and we're now embarked on a 6-year process at the end of which, if the Southerners don't like the way the Northerners continue to treat them, are not satisfied with the Northerners living up to the provisions of the peace accord, the Southerners can vote to secede at the end of 6 years. That would be in 2011. Now, the second thing that's going on is that in the middle of these negotiations, that Senator Danforth from St. Louis, Missouri, and I was born in St. Joe, so I can say Missouri, Senator Danforth essentially operating as the President's special envoy for Sudan, and he was rolled out just a week before September 11th. Senator Danforth convinced the President that the Sudanese of both sides, North and South, were willing to look at the prospects for peace. And thus the U.S. had an important role in catalyzing the negotiations and the Kenyan mediation that resulted in a comprehensive peace accord on the 9th of January last year, 2005. Now, in the midst of all these talks, suddenly you had an insurgency erupt in Darfur. 2003, February, you got the main 3 ethnic groups there among those who farm. They also keep animals, but they're essentially farmers. They launched an insurgency. The Fur, after whom that area of Sudan is named, Darfur means the land of the Fur. The Zagawa, which is a very large ethnic group that spills across the western border of Sudan into Chad, and the Masalit. Those 3 peoples basically formed the basis of an insurgency that during 2003 rolled up several hundred police posts, captured the airport and air base at El Fasher, the largest town in all of Darfur, and essentially caused fear and rage in Khartoum, where the authorities were surprised at the extent of unhappiness in Darfur. Now, these people aren't asking for independence. They say they've been marginalized. They aren't getting the benefits of the oil money that Sudan's been pumping since 1998. And the government, though, was so surprised and enraged that it responded with a massive overreaction, with an effort to undermine the base of support for the armed insurgents, and with direct military attacks on both villages and on insurgent units where they could find them. And that's led us to the situation today where we finally, thanks to the Nigerians and to the U.S. State Department and a number of other intermediaries, got an agreement in May of this year, but unfortunately, while the government signed it and the government seems willing to address Darfur grievances, the insurgency had fragmented and major elements of it weren't happy with the agreement and wouldn't sign. So we're now in a situation where we've got one insurgent element on the side of the government and that element attacking the remaining part of the insurgency that hasn't yet been satisfied with what's on the table.
Now I know as a diplomat, you're a policy implementer, or you let people know what policy is. But if you could be the policy guru here, how would you solve the situation in Darfur today if you were given free rein?
Well, first of all, I've been retired for 6 years, so I don't have a policy role. But it is so clear to me, and I can point everybody in the audience to an opinion editorial piece in the Washington Post 2 days ago by Dr. Chester Crocker, who was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in 2 administrations, that of Mr. Clinton and that of Mr. Bush, and to Dr. Stephen Morrison, who's the Africa section head at the Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies. 2 of those men looked at Darfur and said, look, we're doing 2 things wrong. One is we're shouting, we're engaging in what the Deputy UN Secretary General called megaphone diplomacy. We're not listening, we're just shouting. And the second, we've got some fantasies by certain people who pretend that the U.S. can successfully engage in military intervention in Sudan. Take those off the table, go back to square one, start listening, start trying to build the right coalitions among the people who are interested. And they start with the Chinese. China imports all of the oil, or most of the oil, that Sudan isn't using and is exporting today. China's got a veto in the UN Security Council. You can't have a successful Security Council effort in Sudan unless the Chinese are willing to accept it. Since they're getting their oil from Khartoum, they're going to insist that Khartoum be part of that process. The second group are the Arabs. The entire Arab League needs to be brought diplomatically on board to help convince the government in Khartoum, which is now, you'll recall, a coalition with the Southerners, but must help convince the main power in that government, who see themselves as Arabs, that the prosperity of Sudan and indeed the well-being of the entire sub-region depends on resolving the grievances of Darfur and any other grievances of regional areas of Sudan. For example, the east of Sudan has had a set of grievances. There'd been fighting in the east among the peoples who were there, the Beja, who formed such a strong force that fought against the British when they tried to reconquer Sudan in the 19th century. The government has signed an agreement with the Beja. It was signed about 2 weeks ago in neighboring Eritrea. That's the path that we need to see followed to bring a just and sustainable resolution to what's going on in Darfur.
Another picture we talked before we went on, the program began, is this is the historic Sudan. It's a marvelous picture here.
Yeah, Michael caught this picture when they were up visiting this particular area, which is a necropolis of the Kingdom of Kush. And the pyramid is one of the Merowe pyramids in the southern part of that kingdom. One of the things that's very interesting about Sudan is you have a couple dozen archaeology teams now working particularly in northern Sudan, and they have found for sure the oldest black kingdom in Africa rose in Sudan. And if you go back 250,000 years in the northern part of the Nile, there is an island that the French have been excavating, and they have found 2 distinct layers of civilization, one from Homo erectus and one from Homo sapiens. And there is great speculation now, and they're working at documenting it, that they may be able to show the transition from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens in the middle of the northern Nile there. And so it's very interesting that man may have taken his first footsteps, as we know man, in this part of the world. So it's a very historic place.
Talk a little bit about the history of Sudan.
Well, the recorded history goes back, let's say, 5,000 years. And of course, it was the Egyptians who did the recording of it because they called their rivals in what is today the north of Sudan the Kingdom of Kush, as Vicki just mentioned. And Kush was a rival to Egypt for thousands of years. The first great black kingdom arose in what is now the Sudanese village of Kerma on the Nile, several hundred miles south of the present-day border with Egypt. And there's, in fact, the largest single religious monument in ancient Africa is still there. It's a mud brick temple known as the Western Dafufa. Now, what happened there was that Kush traded extensively in products such as cheetahs and animal skins and, of course, slaves with Egypt. The Egyptians became unhappy, and sometime after 1500 BC, the Egyptian New Kingdom attacked and subjugated that part of Sudan. Well, that didn't last, because several hundred years later, the Sudanese returned the favor, the Nubians, as they're called, a people who extend across both borders, southern Egypt and northern Sudan, and they gave to Egypt its 25th dynasty when they conquered Egypt about 800 BC. They took the title Pharaoh. They took all of the elements of Egyptian religion, modifying them slightly with a different focus on certain deities, but the pharaohs all went home to be interred. And the royal cemetery, or royal necropolis, for the northern capital of the Kingdom of Kush has been excavated, and there are some marvelous remains that come from there.
One of the little-known facts of Sudan is it actually has more pyramids than Egypt, which is, you know, there's a lot of little trivia like that that's sort of interesting.
Now, they're not as big, mine, but in fact, you do get a huge number of pyramids, and there's one of the most unfortunate real examples of art looting that you see at the southern capital of the Kingdom of Kush at Merowe, and you showed that picture earlier. The tops of all those pyramids were knocked off by an Italian adventurer in the mid-19th century looking for gold. He actually found some, and some of that gold, those artifacts, are in the Berlin Museum today, as I understand it.
This picture is a marvelous panorama. Is this pretty typical countryside in the Sudan?
That's a village waking up in the morning in the Nuba Mountains. Now, the Nuba Mountains might resonate with some of the audience because the last two books of any merit on photography on Sudan were done by the controversial late German photographer Leni Riefenstahl. She did People of Cow and Last of Nuba. And this is a village in the Nuba Mountains. We were wondering what had happened to Nuba in the near 30 years since Leni Riefenstahl was there photographing essentially naked people going about their ceremonies and their daily life.
I think the thing that probably, as Americans are more familiar with, is the relief of Khartoum and the British phase and all that. Is that part of, talk about that part of the history.
It's an incredibly evocative period in imperial history, because you had a very prominent and religious figure of the 19th century, Charles Chinese Gordon. He picked the nickname up when he was operating in China. The Egyptians, who had suzerainty over Sudan at this period, having conquered Khartoum and the surrounding areas in their war of 1820-1821, asked Charles Gordon to go down to Sudan, made him ultimately Governor General. He did 2 tours there. He tried to suppress the slave trade, the very trade that brought the Egyptians to Sudan in the first place. And there's some wonderful text that we've quoted from where Mohammed Bey is telling his military commander in 1821 that the reason we're in Sudan is in the search for Negroes to be made into slaves to become part of his army. But the Egyptians had become more enlightened. Gordon was named Governor General, but he was named Governor General just at a time of a millenarian religious movement in Sudan, a movement that produced a figure who called himself the Islamic Redeemer, the Mahdi. And the Mahdi proclaimed himself in 1881 and succeeded against all odds to build a force that besieged Khartoum, captured it. Chinese Gordon's head was cut off, presented to the Mahdi, who was said to have been appalled. He wanted to make Gordon a prisoner. And for the next 13 years, the Mahdi died shortly after Gordon did of disease, and his successor ruled by fire and sword the Mahdiya, the empire created as a result of the religious army of the Mahdi's successor. It was only in 1898 that the British and Egyptians put together a force, partly motivated because the French were making inroads into Central Africa, went down and destroyed the Mahdi's empire in a fight outside of Omdurman, one of the 3 cities that makes up present-day Greater Khartoum. It was a massive defeat. It was well described by Winston Churchill, who was part of the charge of the 21st Lancers. An unfortunate charge because the Lancers thought they were only facing several hundred dervishes, as they called the Mahdi's, the Khalifa's forces, the deputy of the Mahdi, the Khalifa. And in fact, they were hidden by a fold on the ground were several thousand. And Lieutenant Grenfell, who was leading the 21st Lancers, fell, and there is an obelisk to his memory on the battlefield of Kareri there north of Omdurman to this day. But Churchill's prose is riveting as he describes what happened to the 21st Lancers in that charge.
Here's another interesting picture of brick making. That's a marvelous picture. Is that?
Yes. Well, Khartoum is built on clay. It's kind of like Paducah, as I understand it, where you go not too far down and you've got clay. And as a result, the young man bending over the bricks is preparing the bricks to be ready to be fired. And the photo on the opposite is a brick kiln, and that is in Darfur on the edge of El Fasher, between El Fasher and the main displaced persons camp that has about 60,000 people in it today. And there they're firing bricks that are used for construction of houses and businesses throughout Greater Khartoum on the one hand, and El Fasher there in North Darfur on the other.
Sudan as a country, so dates back how far did you say?
Well, modern Sudan became independent the 1st of January 1956. But as an entity, and perhaps Vicki can jump in here with the way Arab geographers regarded it.
Arab geographers referred to the whole area south of the Aswan Dam, which is really the border with Egypt, as Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. And modern Sudan has been kind of put together over the last couple of hundred years through both the Anglo-Egyptian explorations south of Khartoum into the south to the border where Uganda is now, part of the search for the origin of the Nile, and in the process, they incorporated a good part of southern Sudan into what is all of current Sudan. At the turn of the century, you had the French in parts of, you had the French in Chad, right?
Yes.
Where the French were in Chad and further south. And during a succession of sort of colonial wars, the British, through negotiations and through conquering, acquired bits that they put into their colonial empire. And then the boundaries of current Sudan were drawn at the time of independence from British territory, basically. British-controlled territory.
As we're talking history, there's an interesting aspect of America in Sudan that perhaps I can share with
Please
you
do.
and the audience. Is that, to my knowledge, the first American to go into Sudan was with the Egyptian forces in that war of 1820 or 1821. And I regret I don't have more detail on that. But the second and the most prominent 19th century American who did a voyage into Sudan was the indefatigable traveler Bayard Taylor. And his book, Journey to Central Africa, describes his 1853 visit to Sudan, where he actually had the American flag on the back of the boat that he used to fight the current going up the Nile, because remember the Nile runs north
Right.
to get into Egypt. Now, Taylor lost his flag down among the Shilluk, a people on the White Nile who had been the bulwark against Arab expansion south up until about 1850 or so. The Arabs at the time all looking for slaves. Now, there were a number of Americans who were part of the British force that destroyed the Mahdiya in 1898, and one of them wrote a book. George Stevens' name sticks in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the next most prominent American, and indeed perhaps the most prominent American of all to visit Sudan, was hunting in East Africa in 1909 and went up the White Nile in 1910. He stopped at the Presbyterian mission that was at the intersection of the White Nile and the Sobat River, its tributary, and then Teddy Roosevelt continued on to Khartoum, arriving in March of 1910 with his son and hunting partner Kermit, and he met his wife Edith there in Khartoum, toured the battlefields, the war having ended, and there's some wonderful pictures in the archives at the Library of Congress of Teddy Roosevelt on a camel at the Karari battlefield,
sure.
and at garden parties in Khartoum, looking bully,
of course,
and extolling the British victory over the Mahdiya.
He would.
It wasn't until, I think it was Richard Nixon might have visited, no, I'm sorry, it was George Bush who visited as vice president in about 1885 in the effort to convince the Sudanese to let the Falasha Jews transit through Sudan on their way from Ethiopia to Israel. That you had another prominent American visit.
We are
1985.
1985.
We're out of time.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I might add, there's a traveling exhibit of these photos on display in Humboldt, Tennessee, until December the 22nd. And that's do you know the name of the place in Humboldt?
It's the Tennessee Arts Center, I believe.
Okay, it's a traveling exhibit, so
yeah.
Humboldt's not too far from here. We're out of time. Thank you all for coming in.
Such a delight.
I'm Barry Craig. My guests today were Timothy Carney and his wife, Victoria Butler. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.